I'm Richard Swinburne. I was Professor of the Philosophy of Religion at the University of Oxford for many years. I am now, in theory, retired, but this is a pure theoretical status because I spend most of my time doing philosophy. I write books, I write articles, I go and lecture in various universities on philosophy, various philosophical matters, but above all, the philosophy of religion. As we grow older, we are naturally aware of a very big world in which we live, and if we're at all sensitive, we will realize how fortunate we are to be alive and how wonderful the world is in various ways, although there's, of course, many things wrong with it. And it will surely occur to us that in this situation we ought to consider why it is that we're here. Who has caused us to be here, if anyone has caused us to be here. So I think everybody has an obligation who finds a big present on their doorstep to consider whether anyone is responsible for this, and if so, to try and express gratitude to them. And if we look around and think about it, I believe there are good reasons for believing that God has made us and keeps us in being. He's made the whole universe. He keeps the whole universe in being. He keeps the laws of nature operative so that we live in a regular place and we are able to make differences to it. And that's a great blessing, and a great blessing that God has done this for us. So we ought to try and interact with this being. And how should we do that? Well, we will try and pray, no doubt, but God would want to interact with us, and so he would want to tell us how to pray and how to deal with our problems and how to become better people. And for that purpose, we need to consider what the great religions have suggested, that God has, how God does interact with us and what further we can know about God. And as we look around, of course, there are a number of rival religions which hold that to Christianity, which hold that there is a God. There is Islam, there is Judaism, and some of the Indian religions also believe in something like a God in the Christian tradition. But Christianity makes a unique claim which other religions don't, and that is the claim that God himself has come and shared our life on earth in the form of Jesus Christ. And that's a very big claim which certainly we ought to have a look at. And when we do have a look at it, we might ask to start with, well, why on earth should God do such a thing? But if we reflect on God's goodness, we can see that there are at least three good reasons why God would do that. The first and most important of those reasons is it must occur to us there is an awful lot of suffering in the world, and clearly if we've come to believe in God, we've come to have some idea of why he would allow this to occur. I think he allows this to occur in order to give humans significant free will over what happens, and some of the natural disasters are great opportunities for us to react in the right way to them and gradually form a holy character. And giving an account of why God would allow evil to occur is providing a theodicy. But nevertheless, there is a lot of evil and suffering in the world, and we may think God provides us with this for good purpose. But if God makes us suffer for a good purpose, there comes a time when God ought to suffer with us. I give you an illustration. Suppose that there is a war. My country is at war with another country, and there is conscription. Many people are called up to serve in the forces. And conscription is usually announced in the form of all young persons, young men, young women perhaps also, of a certain age, have to serve in the armed forces. And suppose our government announces that everyone between the age of 18 and 25 has to serve. But they add a rubric, they add an extra clause saying if parents are very unhappy with this, they can apply for exemption for their child. Now suppose I have a son between 18 and 25, suppose he's called up, he asks me to seek exemption for this. I refuse. I think he ought to serve his country, and it would be good to do so. But suppose I am also of an age who is able to fight, though not compelled by conscription law to fight, then I ought to volunteer to fight too. That is to say, if I've made someone suffer for a good cause, I ought to suffer with him. So long, if it's a really big bit of suffering, I ought to undertake quite a bit of suffering myself. I think that's our first reason why God would become incarnate, as the Christian doctrine puts it, incarnate, taken upon himself a human nature. And then again, humans have sinned. Humans have done wrong to God. If we've done wrong to someone, we ought to say sorry. Yes, we ought to be genuinely sorry and say so. But if we've wronged somebody, and we ought to make reparation for the wrong. I mean, if, for example, if I've stolen your watch, I ought to repay the watch, give it back to you. But if I can't give it back to you, I ought to buy a new one. Well, we're a bit in that position with regard to God. God has given us a great life, and we've made a mess of it in various ways in our relations with each other. But of course, all the wrongs we do to someone else are also a wrong to the person who created them, viz. God. And both by the harm we have done them, his creatures, and by the harm we have caused him in misusing his gift of life to us. So, and of course we have wronged him directly in not praying and interacting and listening to him as we should. So we've wronged him a lot, and we've got to pay reparation as well as saying sorry. But of course we owe him a lot of life anyway, and what on earth can we give God back? Well, what he really wants back is a perfect human life, but we can't offer that. So the Christian doctrine of the atonement says that one reason why he came to earth was so to live a perfect life, which we could offer back as the life we ought to have led. We can say to him, please take this life as the life I ought to have led. So that's the second reason why he might come to earth, to provide us with a means of reparation for our wrongdoing. Of course, he could have let us off our sins without demanding reparation, but when someone has committed a serious wrong, law courts take the view that it's good for the person who's done wrong to take their wrong so seriously that they make reparation. And if they can't do it themselves, then at least they can offer the reparation that someone else has offered. And then God might come to earth to show us truths and show us how to live. So for all these reasons, we might expect the God in whom we have come to believe to interact with us and to come to earth to share our lot. And again, if you look at all the great religions, most of them don't make that sort of claim, certainly not the great ones. Buddhism doesn't claim that Buddha was God who came to earth. Islam does not claim that Muhammad was God who came to earth. So you might expect God to become incarnate, and only one of the great religions claims that he does. So let's see if Jesus lived the sort of life which you might expect God to live if he came to earth for those purposes. Well, he'd have to live a difficult life. He'd have to endure the evils that we endure to some considerable extent, and of course to be sentenced to death and crucified is certainly enduring one of the worst things that can happen to people. He's got to say that he's God, or make it clear to us that he's God. He's got to live a otherwise good life, and he's got to provide good moral teaching in order to reveal things to us. And he's got to say that his life is an atonement for our sins. And of course, if you look at the life of Jesus, this is just what he did and said. So there's good reason for believing him to be God incarnate. But there's another reason too, which is that God might have, if God was to really show this to us, he needs to put what I may call his signature on this. Someone's signature is some act, some item that only they can bring about. And so in the Middle Ages, someone's signature was the impress made by their signet ring. They only had the signet ring, so anything with that mark on it was produced by them. In more modern times, someone's signature is what we think of literally as their signature. That is the way they write their own name, and most people would only write that name somewhat similar to the way we write it, not exactly the same. So if someone's signature is on something, that indicates that they've done it. Now, how is God to put his signature on the life of someone? He can do that only by doing an act which he alone can do. And since he keeps operative the laws of nature, the way he can do such an act is by setting them aside. Only God can set them aside for some purpose. And he can therefore put his signature on the life of Jesus by setting aside some law of nature, by bringing about an event which couldn't have come about except by God's action, and doing that in a context which would make it clear that that is his signature on the life of Jesus. Well, bringing to life someone dead for 36 hours is clearly something that doesn't happen in the normal course of things. It is, if it was brought about by God, it is God setting aside the laws of nature, and no one else could have brought it about. But why think that that is, as it were, his mark of approval on the teaching of Jesus? Well, because in Jewish society of the first century, they all read their Bibles, their Old Testament, and among the passages which they are well aware of, as we know from the Gospels, is the passage in the book of Deuteronomy which says how you will recognize a true prophet. You will recognize a true prophet because he teaches that there is only one God, the God of Israel. Well, of course, Jesus did that. And you will also recognize a true prophet if what he predicts comes to pass when you wouldn't otherwise expect it to come to pass. And one thing that Jesus said was that there would be a general resurrection. Everyone would rise from the dead. And therefore, among the other people who would rise from the dead is himself. And so if he prophesied a resurrection, and the resurrection indeed occurred, and clearly no one but God could have brought it about, it constitutes God's signature on the teaching of Jesus in this respect as in other respects. So we can get a lot of knowledge about God and his actions with us in the Christian religion, which is authenticated by the life of Jesus and God's signature on it. Why does that matter to us? Well, if what Jesus taught was true, he taught us how to pray, he taught us how to live, which isn't, humans try and find that out for themselves, but it's not always very obvious. Jesus gave us an ideal of what a perfect life would be like, and we can imitate it. But of course we err, we make mistakes, we wrong God. Jesus provided a means by which we could ask God to forgive us, a means by which we could offer his atonement, and God would forgive us in virtue of that. So God provided a way in which we could have our wrongdoing remitted. And he provided this ideal of how to live. He provided detailed rules for how to live, told us what things were right and what things were wrong. And, well, that all happened 2,000 years ago. How are we to, as it were, keep in touch now? Well, he also provided a church, which has continued from from the group of disciples whom Jesus had around him. And the church is there to provide us with encouragement, to provide us with understanding of Jesus' teaching, to provide us with the means of accessing God's benefits. It has a ceremony of introduction, baptism, which is God's symbolic washing away of our wrongdoing, and a symbol, the Eucharist, in which we represent God's sacrifice of his life through Jesus to him again, and ask him in virtue of that to forgive us our sins. So we come into contact with God in these ways. We learn how to live, how to get closer to God, how to deal with our fellow men, how to make ourselves prepared for what he also offered to us as a hope, a greater life in which we would be closer to him. So here's a wonderful gift of knowledge and a wonderful way of interacting with God, which God had provided for us. And if we're at all sensitive to the fact that he's made us for a purpose, and we're grateful for that, and in any way sensitive to what is our ultimate well-being, this is certainly something with which we should grasp.